Case of Jennie Brice by Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Read by Ghosty Keys. It was after 4 when Mr. Holcomb had finished going over the room. I offered to both gentlemen some tea, for Mr. Pittman had been an Englishman and I had gotten into the habit of having a cup in the afternoon. But they both refused. Mr. Howe said he had promised to meet a lady, and to bring her through the flooded district in a boat, so he shook hands with me and smiled at Mr. Holcomb. You'll have to restrain his enthusiasm, Mrs. Pittman. He's a bloodhound on the scent. If his baying gets on your nerves, just send for me. And he went down the stairs and stepped into the boat. Remember, Holcomb, every well-constituted murder has 2 things. First, a motive, and second, a corpse. If you haven't either, you only have a mass of piffling details. Well, if everybody waited until we saw flames instead of relying on the testimony of the smoke, we could certainly reduce the loss from fire. Mr. Howell pulled his boat to the front door and sitting down, prepared to row out. You've been warned, Mrs. Pittman, he called to me. If he doesn't find a body to fit the clues, he's quite capable of making one to fill the demand. Horn, said Mr. Holcomb, looking at the slip of paper again. The tail of the end's been torn off, evidently only part of a word. Horn, hornet, horning, horner. Mrs. Pittman, will you go with me to the police station? Well, I was more than anxious to go. In fact, I could not bear the idea of staying alone in that house, with heaven only knows what concealed in the depths of that muddy floodwater. I got my wraps on, and Mr. Holcomb rowed me out. Peter plunged into the water to follow, and I had to send him back, and he sat on the lower step and whined as we rowed away. Mr. Holcomb threw him another piece of liver, but he wouldn't touch it. Well, we rode to the corner of Robinson Street and Federal. It was before Federal Street was raised above flood level. And we left the boat there in charge of a boy. And from there we were able to walk to the police station on dry land. On the way, Mr. Holcomb questioned me closely about the events of the morning, and I recalled the incident of the burned pillow slip. He made a note at once, very thoughtful. He left me, however, at the police station. I'd rather not appear in this, Mrs. Pittman, he said apologetically. And I think better along my own lines anyways. Not that I have anything against the police, they've done some splendid work. But this case takes imagination. And the police department deals with facts. And we have no facts. What we need, of course, is to have the man detained until we're sure of our case. He lifted his hat and turned away, and I went slowly up the steps to the police station. Living as I had in a neighborhood where the police, like the poor, are always with us, and where the visits of the patrol wagon are one of those familiar sights that no amount of repetition enabled any of us to treat with contempt. I was uncomfortable until I remembered that my grandfather had been one of the first mayors of the city, and that if the patrol had been to my house more than once, the entire neighborhood would testify that my boarders were usually orderly. At the door, someone touched me on the arm, and it was Mr. Holcomb again. I've been thinking it over. I think you'd better mention that note behind the stand. Oh, no, sorry, I read that wrong. I've been thinking it over, and I believe you've better not mention that piece of paper that you found behind the washstand. They might say the whole thing is a hoax. Well, very well, I agreed, and so I went in. The police sergeant in charge knew me at once, having stopped at my house more than once in flood time for a hot cup of coffee. "Sit down, Mrs. Pittman. I suppose you're still making the best coffee and donuts in the city of Allegheny." "Well, what's the trouble in your district? Want an injunction against the river for trespass?" "Well, very well," I agreed, and went in. "The river has brought me a good bit of trouble. I'm worried, Mr. Sergeant. I think that maybe a woman from my house has been murdered, but I don't know." "Murdered?" He drew up his chair. "Tell me about it." And so I told him everything while he sat back with his eyes half closed, his fingers beating a tattoo on the arm of his chair. When I finished, he got up and went into an inner room, and he came back in a moment. "All right, I want you to come in and tell that same thing to the chief." And he led the way. All told, I ended up repeating my story 3 times that afternoon. First to the sergeant, then to the chief of the police, and then a 3rd time to both of the others and 2 detectives to boot. The 2nd time, the chief made notes of what I'd said. "Any of you know this man, Ladley?" But none of them did. They all knew of Jennie Brice. Some of them had seen her at the theater. "Tom, get to the theater." Luckily, what he learned over the telephone from the theater corroborated my story. Jennie Brice was not in the cast that week, but should have reported that Monday morning to rehearse next week's piece. No message had been received from her, and a substitute had been put in her place. The chief hung up the receiver and he turned to me. "Are you sure about the clock, Mrs. Pittman? It was there when they moved upstairs to the room." "Yes, sir." "Are you certain that you will not find it in the parlor mantel when the water goes down?" "The mantels are already uncovered now. It's not there." "You think Ladley is gone for good?" "Yes, sir. He'd be a fool to try to run away unless... Graves, you better get a hold of that fellow and keep him, either until the woman's body is found or she returns. The river is falling, and in a couple days we'll know if she's around either way." So before I left, I described Jennie Brice for them carefully. Asked what she probably wore and if she had gone away as her husband said. I told her I had no idea. She had lots of clothes and dressed a good bit. But I recalled that that morning, I had seen, lying on the bed, a black and white dress with a red collar, and they took that down, as well as the brown valise. The chief rose and opened the door for me himself. "If she actually left town at the time you mentioned, she ought not to be hard to find. There are not many trains before 7 in the morning, and most of them are locals. And if she did not, if he... Do you think she's in the house or the cellar?" "Not unless Ladley is more of a fool than I think he is. Personally, I think she's gone away, as he says she did. But if she hasn't, he probably took the body with him when he said he was getting medicine and dropped it in the current somewhere. We must go slow with all this. There's no use shouting wolf yet." But the towel." "Well, he may have cut himself shaving. It has been done." "And the knife?" He shrugged his shoulders good-naturedly. "I've seen a perfectly good knife spoiled opening a bottle of pickles." "But the slippers? And the clock?" "My good woman, enough shoes and slippers are forgotten in the bottoms of cupboards year after year in flood time and are found floating around the streets to make all the old clothes men in town happy. I have seen almost everything floating about during one of these floods." "I dare say you've never seen an onyx clock floating around," I replied a little sharply, for I had no sense of humor that day, and he stopped smiling at once and stood tugging at his mustache. "No," he admitted, The onyx clock sinks, that's true. That's a very nice little point, that onyx clock. He might be trying to sell it, or perhaps he didn't finish. Well, I went back immediately. I only stopped at the market for meat for Mr. Reynolds' supper, and it was 5:30 and dusk was coming on. I got a boat and was rowed directly home. Peter was no longer at the foot of the steps, and I paid the boatman and let him go and turned to go up the stairs. I heard someone speaking in the hall above. I have read somewhere that no two voices are exactly alike, just as no two violins ever precisely produce the same sound. I think it's what they call the timbre that is different. I have, for instance, never heard a voice like Mr. Pittman's. Although Harry Lauder's in a phonograph resembles it a bit. And voices have always done for me what odors do for some people. They revive forgotten scenes, old memories. But the memory that the voice at the head of the stairs brought back was not very old, although I had forgotten it. But now I seemed to hear it again all at once, the lapping of the water on Sunday morning as it began to come over the door sill, the sound of Terry ripping up the parlor carpet, and Mrs. Ladley calling me a she-devil in the next room as a reply to this very voice. When I got to the top of the stairs, it was only Mr. Howe, who had brought his visitor to the flood district and, on getting her splashed with muddy water, had taken her to my house for a towel and a cake of soap. "I know we are intruders, Mrs. Pittman," she said, holding out her hand, "especially now when you are in trouble." "I've told Mrs. Harvey a little," Mr. Howe said, "and I promised to show her Peter, but he's not here." As soon as I saw her, I knew it was my sister's child from the moment I lit the lamp. There was something of Alma in her, just not quite her hardness or haughtiness. But Alma's dark blue eyes with black lashes and her nose. She was always the beauty of the family. What with the day's excitement and seeing Alma's child like this in my house, I felt things going round and clutched at the stair rail. Mr. Howe caught me. "Why, Mrs. Pittman, what's the matter?" I got myself in hand in a moment and smiled at the girl. "Nothing at all. Indigestion, most likely. Too much tea the last day or two, or maybe simply not enough spoiled food. I've been not too anxious to eat." Lida, for she was that to me instantly, although I had never seen her before. Lida was all sympathy and sweetness. She actually asked me to go with her to a restaurant and have a real dinner. Imagine if Alma could have known. But I excused myself. "Sorry, I have to cook something for Mr. Reynolds, and I'm better now anyhow, thank you." "Mr. Howe, may I speak to you for a moment?" He followed me along the back hall, and now it was dusk. "I have remembered something that I've forgotten, Mr. Howe," I said. "On Sunday morning, the Ladleys had a visitor." "Yes?" "They had very few visitors." "I see." "I did not see him, but I heard his voice." Mr. Howe did not move, but I fancy he drew his breath in rather quickly. "It sounded... Oh, it was not by chance you." I? A newspaper man who goes to bed at 3 a.m. on Sunday morning, up at about 10. Well, I didn't say what time it was, I said sharply. But at that moment, Lyda called from the front hall. I think I hear Peter. He's shut in there somewhere. We went forward at once, and she was right. Peter was scratching at the door of Mr. Ladley's room, although I had left the door closed and Peter in the hall. I let him out, and he crawled to me on 3 legs, whimpering. Mr. Howell bent over him and felt the 4th. Poor little beast. His leg's broken. He made a splint for the dog, and with Lyda helping him, they put him to bed in a clothes basket in my upstairs kitchen. It was easy to see how things lay with Mr. Howell. He was all eyes for her, made excuses to touch her hand, her arm, little caressing touches that made her color heighten. And with it all, there was a sort of helplessness in his manner, as if he knew how far this girl was out of his reach. Knowing Alma and her pride, I knew that better than any how hopeless it was for him. But I was not so sure about Lyda. I wondered if she was in love with the boy, or just in love with love. She was very young, as I had been. God help her if, like me, she sacrificed everything to discover only too late that she was simply in love with love. Right. Well, there you go. Chapter 4.